Lesson 3. Conflict with American Indians. When the first Europeans arrived in North America, they settled on lands that had belonged to American Indians. Although the two groups made attempts to cooperate, repeated conflicts brought tension, mistrust, and sometimes violence. Get ready to read. Start up. The U.S. Army captured these Seminole chiefs in 1824. Why did white Americans oust American Indians from their homes? Guiding questions. How did Indian removal change the country? What did the frontier mean to the nation in the first half of the 19th century? Describe the cultures of the American Indians living west of the Appalachians. Vocabulary. Frontier. Worcester versus Georgia. Indian Removal Act. Indian Territory. Trail of Tears. Academic vocabulary. Acquire. Exceedingly. American Indians and the frontier. As American settlers moved west in the early 1800s, they often attacked American Indians to force them to give up their land or in response to hostile raids. American Indians, in turn, attacked settlers to protect their way of life. Oftentimes, the settlers were greater in number and better armed. A history of conflict and prejudice. On both sides, biases, stereotypes, and prejudices led to mistrust and hostility. Most white settlers saw American Indians as dangerous and untrustworthy. American Indians feared that settlers' hunger for land could never be satisfied, and that settlers meant to kill them off. These fears fueled many bloody conflicts. As you have learned, before the Revolution, the British had made peace with American Indian groups by drawing the Proclamation Line of 1763 through the Appalachian Mountains. This line marked roughly the frontier or edge of white settlement. The frontier separated white settlers from the lands beyond, which they regarded as free and open to them. The 1763 proclamation forbade whites to settle west of the line. This gave American Indians some protection from settlers who wanted to take over their lands. Seeing the British as protectors, many American Indians had sided with them during the Revolutionary War. After the war, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance to bring order to white settlement of the Northwest Territory. One part of the ordinance provided a method for settlers to acquire land and eventually achieve statehood. The ordinance fueled even more movement of people into the territory. Believing their land and culture were at stake, American Indians attacked white settlements in the new Northwest Territory. The Battle of Tippecanoe in Indiana in 1811 was a major defeat for Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his forces during this time of unrest. When conflict between the United Kingdom and the United States broke out again in the War of 1812, many, but not all, American Indian groups again sided with the British. A group of Creek in present-day Georgia and Alabama formed an alliance with both Tecumseh and the British. Meanwhile, other Creeks and the neighboring Choctaw sided with the United States. As you have learned, forces led by Andrew Jackson defeated the Creeks allied with the British. The conflicts usually ended badly for the American Indians. They either lost in battle or signed treaties with the government that were soon broken. The first treaty between the U.S. government and American Indians was signed in 1778. Few promises made in that treaty with the Delaware were kept. Likewise, in 1794, the Pickering Treaty between the United States and the Iroquois was also broken. The treaty returned over 1 million acres to the Iroquois, but much of the land was taken again. It is not surprising that American Indians were exceedingly distrustful of their white neighbors. Efforts to make peace. The Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee nations lived in parts of what are now Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. The Shawnee, Potawatomi, Sauk, and Fox nations lived in parts of present-day Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Many hoped to live in peace with their white neighbors on the frontier. The Choctaw believed they would be allowed to keep their land because they had sided with the United States during the War of 1812. Other tribes, like the Cherokee Nation, adopted European customs, hoping that this would help them to preserve their land. The Cherokee created a legal system and government that blended European and Cherokee traditions. In 1821, Sequoyah, a Cherokee man, created a writing system for his people. Using Sequoyah's letters, Cherokee children learned to read and write. The Cherokees also published a newspaper. The efforts of American Indians to adopt European ways failed to end the conflict with white settlers. The American Indians' fertile land remained attractive to white settlers, and white settlers feared more violent conflict with American Indians. Reading check. Generate explanations. Why did tensions exist between American Indian groups and white settlers? American Indian removal. In the eyes of state and federal officials, American Indians east of the Mississippi River stood in the way of westward expansion of the United States. At first, they aimed to convince American Indians to rely less on hunting. They wanted them to start farming cash crops, such as tobacco and cotton, in addition to food crops. These government leaders thought that American Indians would sell any land that they weren't farming to white settlers. While many American Indians in the South did adopt cash crop farming, they were not willing to sell their land. Meanwhile, prejudices on both sides stood in the way of white settlers and American Indians living side by side. Pressure on American Indians increases. In 1825, President James Monroe had suggested moving all American Indians living east of the Mississippi to land west of the river. At that time, nothing came of the plan. Yet year by year, the pressure on the American Indians living along the frontier grew. Those in the north occupied land good for growing corn and wheat and raising livestock. The Northwest Ordinance had already marked this land for white settlers. In the south, American Indians occupied land that was good for growing cotton. Around them, more and more white settlers arrived, many with enslaved African Americans, seeking to acquire land to grow cotton. Many white Southerners were demanding that American Indians be removed by force. In 1825 and 1827, the state of Georgia passed laws forcing the Creeks to give up most of their land. Laws such as these had been previously struck down by the Supreme Court in Johnson v. McIntosh, 1823. The ruling in this case stated that only the federal government could acquire land from American Indians, not individuals or state governments. Worcester v. Georgia decision is ignored. Georgia's actions were challenged in two suits that reached the Supreme Court. The decision in the first suit went against the Cherokees. In Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, 1831, the court decided that American Indian groups were not independent nations, and so could not sue Georgia in court. The ruling meant the Cherokee could not stop Georgia from enforcing its law. But in Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, The court ruled that no state had the authority to enforce its laws within Indian territory. Only the federal government had authority over American Indian lands. Therefore, Georgia could not remove the Cherokee. President Jackson disagreed with the ruling in Worcester versus Georgia. In the nullification crisis, Jackson had defended federal power. In the Cherokee case, however, he backed states' rights. Demonstrating that he was only willing to uphold the law when it suited his purpose, Jackson is reported to have said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Instead, Jackson continued to displace American Indians from their homelands. The Indian Removal Act. At Jackson's urging, in 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. This law let the government take land from American Indians in exchange for land west of the Mississippi River. At the time, more than 100,000 American Indians still lived in the East. Most white Americans, especially those in the South, supported the removal. They wanted the land for farming and new settlements. Some supported removal to protect the American Indians from conflicts with settlers. They assumed that the United States would never expand past the Mississippi, so American Indians could live there in peace. Some Americans believed the removal was cruel and unfair, but their protests were ignored. The Indian Removal Act resulted in the expulsion of thousands of American Indians from their homes. In the North, the Ottawa, Potawatomi, Sauk, and Fox peoples all signed treaties to move west to Indian territories in what are now Kansas and Oklahoma. While most members of these groups left, a few stayed behind in what are now Michigan and Wisconsin. Among the groups who tried to refuse to sign treaties were the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole. Ultimately, they were forced to sign and forced from their homelands. Jackson's American Indian removal policy changed the country in several ways. First, it opened up vast areas of the South to white settlers. Many brought slaves with them, so by removing the American Indians, slavery expanded to new places and more states, and became more entrenched. Also, because of Jackson's policy, few American Indians today live east of the Mississippi. As a result, most events in the contemporary United States involving American Indians take place in the West. As well, the policy of taking rich, fertile, forested land from American Indians and restricting them to semi-arid areas in the far West had enormous consequences for American Indians. It impoverished them for generations, separated them from their ancestors' burial grounds, and all but ended their traditional ways of life. Reading check. Explain. Why did Congress pass the Indian Removal Act?